Nice to see you all. I think we can start. Let us begin. We're actually at the end of the first chapter, which is quite a thing because there's a lot of information, if you consider it, that we've accumulated over a relatively short period of time. Here we are. We're ready to wrap up the first chapter of Tanya. And let me tell you that the first chapter ends off on quite a controversial note. So some people get very uncomfortable with what it is that we're going to learn. And then once we've done that, next chapter, the second chapter of Tanya, takes us to this very deep, involved spiritual experience that we're going to begin. So by way of introduction, before we get into the details for this evening, let's just establish one or two important things. One of those important things, in fact, that's where we're going to start our conversation. We've been talking over here about the nefesh hachiyunis, the animating, otherwise known as nefesh habahamis, the animal soul. It's the part of ourselves that we are most, I don't want to say comfortable, because that might be an insult, but it's the part of ourselves that we are most commonly in touch with. The part of ourselves that is self-interested, the part of ourselves that drives our ambition, the part of ourselves that ensures that we preserve our lives, that we don't, God forbid, do anything which could be self-destructive. Well, at least that appears to be self-destructive. So this is it's what we call the animal soul because it's quite impulsive, as an animal would be impulsive. And as a result of that, we discovered last week that there are various kinds of toxic behaviors that your animal soul would be predisposed towards. That's just how it is. If you have a part of the person that is impulsive, that is self-interested, that is totally focused on what's going to make me feel good, well, you can well imagine that that's going to be a part of a person that is going to produce all kinds of negativity. Okay, so we can kind of anticipate that. Hang on for one sec. Just had this little creature crawling all over the camera. I don't know if you could tell or not, but it was very difficult to see anything. Anyhow, so we were talking about our nefesh habahamis, about our animal soul, and how the nature of our animal soul is that it is self-interested and therefore can produce all kinds of toxic behaviors. Now, at this point in time, it sounds like, think of it. We've said words like animal. Nobody likes to acknowledge. Nobody would like to see a part of themselves as animal, right? Let's be honest. On your CV, you're not going to say, I have a strong animal that lives inside of me. Although there are people who'll tell you there's a particular animal that I resonate with and that I identify with. It's actually an interesting way to speak to somebody in an interview and say, which animal would you most associate yourself with and why? Do you see yourself as some kind of a predator? Do you see yourself as a more docile kind of a creature? How do you see yourself? But for a person to define themselves as animalistic, I don't know how comfortable that is. And particularly after last week where we left off that your animal soul could produce things like arrogance or the pursuit of hedonistic pleasure or laziness. So I'd rather shy away from that. I don't want to define myself by my animal soul. So as we left off last week, it appeared to us that the animal soul is all bad. And this is a terrible misconception. Because if this is the part of me that I'm most close to, easy access, if it's the part of myself that I relate to, if it's the first line of personal experience that I have, and then it's all bad, well, what kind of a light do I then see myself in? In a bad light, like an original sin kind of a perspective. And that's not a Jewish way of thinking, as we well know. So we've got to balance this and understand a little bit better what's going on over here. And what we're going to discover, and this is why this is a little bit controversial, or more than a little bit controversial, what we're going to discover is that the animal soul is not all bad. That's true. And that means that if you're not all bad, you're not necessarily as good as you thought you were. That's effectively what we're going to discover. Because we're going to discover that the animal soul is quite complex and it's quite advanced. And the animal soul is quite capable of producing semi-positive behaviors. So let's look at it this way. There's an expression that they use, Yeled Tov Yerushalayim. You ever heard that expression? It's like a goody two-shoes. It's a Hebrew expression for somebody who's just like good, pristine, angelic, and they irritate. Don't they irritate? Those people who are just so good, they're always good, they never do anything wrong, they always conform, they always behave as expected. Doesn't that just like irk you just a little bit? So we have to ask ourselves a question. Is it good enough just to be good? Be a good person very often. And I think a lot of rabbis get wrapped the wrong way by this. But very often people say, you know what, Rabbi, the most important thing is to be a mensch. The most important thing is to be a mensch. And nobody can debate that. Nobody can argue. Of course, it's incredibly important to be a mensch, a decent human being, somebody who cares about others, somebody who has good values. The question really is, what is a mensch? And how do you define a mensch? I have a suspicion that the average person defines a mensch as me and anybody similar to me. It's like, I think I'm a decent person, right? Have you ever heard people say, I don't think I'm a good person? No, most people say I'm a good person. I was chatting to a friend of mine who's an attorney, and we were talking about mediation. I was talking about this yesterday. We were talking about the nature of mediation. And in the course of the conversation, it emerged, whenever you have two people or two parties who are fighting over something, inevitably both sides will tell the mediator, I'm not a bad person. and that's true. That's actually what I mean. I'm not a bad person. So why am I in this major fight with this other person? Oh, that's because of circumstances. That's because of their behavior. That's because, So nobody wants to define themselves as a bad person. So when a person says the most important thing in the world is to be a mensch, basically what they're saying is, I think I'm a mensch, and that's why it's important. Because I don't want to see myself as anything less than good. Well, we're going to revisit the story of what it is to be a mensch, and we're going to ask the question of, does this menschlichkeit, which effectively most people tell you is compassion, generosity, benevolence, those kinds of things, is that actually a sign of a developed, matured spiritual being? Or could it mean something a little bit less exciting, actually? Maybe even a little disappointing. So that's what we're going to explore this evening. In the course of doing this, we're going to discover terminology that will be introduced to us here for the first time, but will be explained in far greater detail in chapters 6 and 7. So this is a heads up. As we go through this terminology in this particular section, keep it in mind because you're going to need it again later, right? It's going to come back again in chapters 6 and 7 in a lot more detail. And because it will be discussed in far greater detail in those sections, we can afford to kind of gloss over it. And then the big whammy of this part of the chapter, this part of Tanya, is that we're going to make a comparison between the default position of what it's like to be a Jewish person and the default position of what it's like to be pretty much anybody else. And it's quite a black and white way of defining the world. So like the Jews and everybody else, Jews and non-Jews. I think some people take offense to that. Say non-Jews. Like there are other classes of people and they're distinct from each other. But in our conversation, and particularly what we're going to focus on this evening, is the notion that the Jews' place and mission in the world is absolutely unique. And although it's uncomfortable for many people, particularly in today's open democratic world, to accept this, as Jewish people, it's critical for us that we recognize it. Because if a person does not appreciate what their mission is, it's near impossible that they'll ever get close to fulfilling it. Because if you're aiming at a different target, then how do you expect to hit the target you were intended to hit? So none of what we're going to learn this evening is intended to be disparaging, and that's why it's controversial for people. But it is intended to give us this very honest assessment of how Jewish people are supposed to view Jewish people. Earlier, somebody made a comment. They said, that the notion of a chosen people is narcissistic. It's quite interesting, right? Narcissistic. The suggestion of a chosen people. I don't know what people think the chosen people is like. What do they think? Do they think we get like discounts at all the shops? Maybe. Do they think that we get an inordinate amount of Nobel Prize winners? Maybe. But we also get an inordinate amount of persecution. And we have this long-standing history. I think it was Groucho Marx who used to say, God, can you not choose somebody else for a change? We've just been battered and hammered, and it's one thing after the next. So being the chosen people isn't narcissistic. If anything, if you really understand what it means to be the chosen people, it's actually a very altruistic statement. Because to acknowledge that I'm part of a chosen nation means that I carry a responsibility to step beyond myself in a way that is not expected of anybody else. And that's a lot of what we're going to learn this evening. So there's an expectation that sits on us to behave in a way that we cannot satisfy ourselves by comparing ourselves to everybody else. And we're forever doing it. So those emails that you get about the Nobel Prize winners, right, makes you feel good inside. Oh, wow, look at this. Out of all the Nobel Prize winners, we have this disproportionate amount of Jewish people. Great, wonderful. Is that our purpose? Can we now turn around and say the Jews have achieved the reason for which God put us on this world to have more Nobel Prize winners than anybody else? Or when we turn around and we say we are responsible for so many welfare organizations in the world, and we are the leaders of the liberal movements, and we fought for the emancipation of slaves, and we fought for people's rights in South Africa, and we fought that these are all beautiful and wonderful things. And we can look around and point an accusatory finger at the rest of the world and say, where were you? And how come you're not represented as much in these fields as we are relative to our numbers? The question is that good enough for Jewish people? Is it good enough for us? And that's why the question this evening is it good enough to be a good Jewish boy? Which becomes like that Yeled Tov Yerushalayim, that irksome expression of what it is to be a good person, a goody two-shoes, an angelic kind of personality, somebody who is so nice and kind and empathetic that everybody else looks around and says, I envy you people because you look after each other in such an incredible way. We do, and that's wonderful, but it may not necessarily be what we're here for. So let's have a look and discover something else about our nefesh habahamis, our animalistic, animal, impulsive soul that we may not have realized. Last week we said all the toxic behavior that a person has needs to, by definition, track back to the animal soul. Has to, because it's not possible that our good, solid, holy self, which we haven't really met yet, and we will meet in the course of the next chapter, it's impossible that part of ourselves could be what produces bad behavior. It's just that the minute you say that the Nefesh HaBahamis produces negative behaviors, well, we tend to then look at things as black and white and say, so you're telling me that the animal soul is all bad. No, we're not. There's this terrible misconception out there that in the frum world, there are people who say, if you have a look in the Talmud, it makes the statement that a child only has a yetzer hara, only has a negative inclination. Now, that's a horrible thing to say. You know how children are. Children are beautiful. They are naive. They have a certain innocence. They are loving. They bounce back from disappointment, and they don't get involved in faribel. Children are great. Why on earth would there be a suggestion that children are all evil inclination? Horrible. How can you say such a thing? Well, the truth is, once we understand what we're talking about over here, actually what we're saying is that children, by definition, are generally powered by their nefesh habahamis, an impulsive side. So when a baby wakes up for the third time in the middle of the night and wants to be fed, that is not, by any stretch, evil, but it is certainly self-interested. The child at that point has not thought of or gotten to the maturity to consider, maybe my mom needs a good night's sleep tonight. No, it's an animalistic, impulsive kind of a response. It's the instinct to remain alive without consideration of anybody else. So is it possible then to have instinct or impulse to be good? Is that a possibility? When we describe this animal soul of ours, is it only impulsively drawn towards horrible things like arrogance and hedonism? Or is it possible that it's also got a good side to it? Says the Alter Rebbe, also those good traits that are part and parcel of the DNA of being Jewish. What are they? Like, for example, compassion and generosity, benevolence, ba'ois mi mena, come from the animal soul. This is a huge shock. Most people who tell you the most important thing is to be a mentsch, it's because they are charitable people. They are people who are deeply compassionate, and they would love the endorsement to know that that's good enough, that that's what Hashem wants. Surely, isn't that what God wants of us? Isn't it that God wants us just to be good people who really care about everybody else? So what does the Alter Rebbe tell us in the context of the Jewish experience? The wiring of our animal, impulsive, self-sustaining persona is that it needs to be kind and it needs to be compassionate. Okay? In the same way as your animal soul will tell you you need to eat, because if you don't eat, you're not going to survive. Your animal soul will tell you you need to be kind and compassionate, because if you're not kind and compassionate, you won't survive. It's a fascinating insight. So let's look for example. Let's use a few examples. So the Torah tells us that one of the non-kosher birds, because you know how it works, the Torah gives us the signs of kosher animals, the signs of kosher fish, and then when it comes to birds, it just gives us the list of non-kosher species of birds. And the implication is that there are far more kosher ones, so you give the shorter list. One of those birds is called chasida. A chasida is a stork. And Rashi comments based on the teachings of the Talmud that why is it called a chasida? Chasida comes from the word kindness, chesed. Why is this non-kosher bird called a chasida? Because it exhibits kindness to its own species. So now the question goes the other way. Wow. Surely the reason that we don't eat certain animals is because of the traits that they represent. So you don't want to eat a cruel predator because you don't want that kind of predatory behavior to become part of your DNA. And we don't eat scavengers because we don't want to be like a scavenger, and so on and so forth. But an animal that gets its name because of the kindness that it shows, surely that should not be non-kosher. So what's the answer? The answer is that it says specifically that it does kindness with its own species. That's an impulsive kindness. That's a kindness that didn't take growth, challenge, personal development, study, meditation. That's just who I am. I am kind. Just the way that I am. Now, you know what the problem is? When a person has any kind of behavior that is an impulsive and unlearned behavior, not unlearned, but it's a behavior that a person hasn't worked to achieve, then you don't know where it's going to go. Kindness. It's a great thing. So I'm a kind person. So every single time I stop at a red light and there's some person standing over there next to me and he's giving the universal symbol for please can I have $2. So when he's standing right next to me, I want to be kind. So I'm going to give the guy money. I'll never forget, years ago, I was driving in Cape Town. I stopped at a red light and these kids came over to the window of the car and they asked for money and I literally had nothing. I didn't have any cash. So I said to them, I have no cash. The window was open. Must have been many years ago if somebody's at your window and the window is wide open. Anyway, so they said, can we have cash? I said, I don't have any cash. So it so happened that I was busy working on a project. We were running like a camp or something. And sitting in the car was a stick of glue. So these kids said, can we just have the glue? Now, when that happened, suddenly you realize, so what were you going to do with the money? I thought I was going to give you money because you were going to go feed yourself. Now I realize that I might be feeding your addiction. It'd be much kinder of me if I gave you food. Or even kinder yet if I found you some kind of a sheltered employment. So who says that the impulsive kindness that we feel that we want to show because we see that somebody is in distress, and I want to be a kind person, which really means I just want to satisfy my conscience. I don't want to walk away or drive away from this feeling guilty that somebody was in a destitute position and I didn't help him. So I actually want to make myself feel better. So I just throw money at the problem, and that way I feel that I've been kind. That's impulsive. Oh, here's another one. One that we can all relate to, right? Jews are very compassionate people. That's what he says. It's based on the Gemara. The Gemara says there are 3 traits that identify the Jewish people: Baishanim, Rachmanim, and Goim Lechasadim. That we are a bashful people, we are a compassionate people, and we are a generous people. Now, the difference between compassionate and generous is what you do with your time or what you do with your resources. Compassionate is that you allow yourself to feel other people's pain. So we're a compassionate people. It's a really good thing for us, right? How wonderful. Isn't it a beautiful thing to be compassionate? Not always. Depends who you're being compassionate to. We've just come from the Shabbos that blesses Purim, and the Haftarah that we read on this Shabbos is the story of King Saul, who was instructed by God's prophet Shmuel that he should go and attack the nation of Amalek and wipe them out because these are truly evil people. And King Saul couldn't do it. He was too compassionate. He wasn't able to destroy everybody. So it says in the Tanakh that he showed compassion to the women and he kept the flocks alive. But the fact is, he showed compassion to the women. And along the way, not necessarily for compassionate reasons, but along the way, he also spared the king, King Agag, the direct ancestor of Haman of the Purim story. The reason we read this particular Haftarah on the Shabbos before Purim to remind us, how did Haman arrive on the scene in the first place? Because somebody was compassionate. because somebody did not destroy who they were expected to destroy. You know, we always go on about how the Israeli Defense Force is the most moral army in the world, and that is definitely something to be proud of, because in war situations, anybody who's never been in a battle won't understand what really happens, and to stick to a moral code and to actually have concern about people and look out for collateral damage, which is a terrible term. That's incredible to have that kind of morality. Sometimes it comes to bite us. Sometimes because we're so compassionate, we actually end up not being able to finish the mission. I once had a conversation with a fellow who was a commander of a particular special forces unit. And he told the story that they were there and they'd been tracking this particular terrorist for months and months. And when it came the moment that they were supposed to go in and assassinate him, turns out that there was a civilian family member, and they called off. This was months of preparation. They called off the attack. Some months later, his unit did a training exercise with a special forces unit from the United States Army. I heard the story firsthand from the guy. And when they were working together, they were doing their training or whatever, it so happened that this story came up in conversation. And the Americans were blown away. They were like, there's no question about it. If you've been working for so long to get a particular target, it's just unfortunate. Okay, now it's a little different because there's all kinds of oversight, but it's just unfortunate that somebody happened to get in the way. As Jewish people, we have this impulsive compassion, and it hasn't always been good for us. If you look at our history, too often we've been compassionate towards those same people who've wanted to kill us, and it hasn't always worked out well. So that's how you know that you're dealing with a raw emotion, not a matured emotion, not a learnt emotion, not something that a person developed because there was a value in developing it. It's just who I am. I cannot say no. You're not like a Jewish mother, well, I suppose a Jewish parent. I just can't say to my little shmulik, he really, really needs this thing. You know, how's he going to survive without it? Every other child in the class has the latest Samsung, the latest iPhone. Yes, my kid's only 6 years old, but so what? How can I deny him? Right? This natural chesed, this natural kindness, it's the same attitude of, please have something more to eat. Right? It's the same attitude. It's natural for us. Why? Because we're naturally kind people. How could somebody come into my house and sit down and I don't feed them? And I have to just not only feed them for now, I've got to make sure that they're taken care of for the next while. I mean, who knows where their next meal will come from? I mean, they may get a flat tire on the way home, they'll be delayed, and it'll be, you know, and who knows, they might have sugar. All right? So that's like this Jewish attitude of kindness and of compassion. So what does the Alter Rebbe tell us? That is the product of the Nefesh HaBahamis, believe it or not. An impulsive kindness, an impulsive compassion means that it's part of my impulsive nature. If it comes naturally to me, if it's my instinct to behave in this particular way, to be benevolent, to be compassionate, if it's instinctive, then it has to belong to the part of me that is my instinct-driven self, my animal soul. Huge surprise. By the way, you will notice that even though the Talmud said there are 3 traits that characterize the Jewish people, here he only tells us 2. He leaves out the idea of being bashful because there's another statement in the Talmud that as we get closer to the time of Mashiach, so we become more chutzpahdik. So there goes the bashfulness of the Jewish people. We kind of lost that somewhere along the way, and we've become a little bit more outspoken, and it's probably appropriate. So now, how could this be? How is it possible that I've got a part of myself that is supposedly instinctive, impulsive, animalistic, and yet it could produce such beautiful, fine traits like kindness and compassion and benevolence? How's that possible? Well, here's where we come to the concept that we'll skim over to a certain extent now, and we'll discuss in far greater detail in chapters 6 and 7. Kibi Yisrael, because in the context of the Jewish experience, inside a Jewish person's reality, Nefesh Zoi di Klippa, this soul that we are describing, which belongs to a reality called Klippa. Okay, there, first piece of jargon that we have to understand. He, Miklipas Noiga, it actually belongs to a particular subcategory of that reality called Klippa. So this subcategory is called Klipas Noiga. Vehi misoid eitz hadas toiv. Sorry, something went wrong over here with the layout. That's how it's supposed to read. It's from Klipas Noiga that also has some goodness in it. And this comes from the spiritual or Kabbalistic secret behind the tree of knowledge. Now everybody just kind of shortens it, the tree of knowledge, but you have to read the full name in order to understand what's going on. So you remember the story of Adam and Eve, right? Adam and Eve are in Gan Eden, this beautiful environment. It's tropical, there are fruit trees everywhere, there's divine revelation. It's a magnificent space to live in. And Hashem tells them, Mikol eitz hagon, out of any tree of this garden, achol tochel, you can eat to your heart's desire. Just the eitz hadas tov v'ra, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, don't eat it. Don't eat the fruit of that tree. You know how it is with people. The minute you tell somebody that they cannot do something, that's immediately when they want to do it. That's actually where we get the expression forbidden fruit. So they go and they eat from the tree of knowledge, and everything changes at that particular point in time. What changed? Let's think about this for a second. So you could read the story as you did when you were 6 years old, because that's what happens. We study these stories when we're little, and we get told the story in a particular context, and then we get stuck with that context often for the rest of our lives. So this is the story. This is how the story goes. There was Adam, there was Eve, they were in a garden, there was a snake. The snake was a really good salesperson. The next thing you know, they're eating this fruit. That's the story. Adam and Eve, the most powerful humans ever. Think about it. Handcrafted by God, not conceived by human parents. This is Adam and Eve, who the Talmud tells us could see from one end of time to the other end of time. From one end of the universe to the other end of the universe. That means that they had insight into all the greatest spiritual levels, and they couldn't have a little bit of self-restraint from one thing that they weren't supposed to eat? Really? That's the story? Plus, let's ask this question. What happens afterwards? So they eat from the forbidden fruit, and then what happens? They get kicked out of the garden, right? It's almost as if Hashem has this major meltdown. How could you have done this? You've betrayed me. You no longer deserve to be in the garden. Out you go. And everybody's going to die, and until you die, it's just going to be a painful experience of rearing children and trying to earn a living. What's really going on over here? Was there no bad in the world up until that point in time? That now they'd eaten this tree of knowledge of good and bad. And there was no, of course there was bad. There was a snake. The snake is the epitome of evil. There was bad in the world. So what most people miss in the story is the name of this tree and the fruit that it bears is Toiv Vera. The way most people understand it, the tree should have been called Eitz Hadas Toiv Oira, the tree of the knowledge of good or evil. But it isn't. It's the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Up until that point in time, as long as they were in the Garden of Eden, there were such clear parameters. Good looked good, and evil looked sinister. That's why the symbol of evil in the story is a snake. Nobody sees a snake coming and says, "Oh, wow, look at that. This is of the neurotoxic variety. Wonderful. Let's see. Let's get close." No, you're not. You run for your life. The Torah specifically chooses the snake as the symbol of the enticer because at that point in time it was absolutely clear that if something lethal comes your way, it looks lethal. Today, lethal things don't look lethal. Today, they're coated in chocolate, lethal things. Today, lethal things, come in a nice white fine powder that people will tell you, try some of this because it's going to make you feel spectacular. Today, all of the behaviors that the Torah opposes are the most attractive behaviors around. Why? Because what happened, what shifted at that time? Good and evil became enmeshed. Prior to eating from the tree of knowledge, good and evil were distinct, they were absolutely separate. And then there was this moment of ingesting toiv vera, a confusing mixture of good and bad. And maybe that's a good way to actually say it. Good and bad. They kind of rolled into one. Whereas the Talmud says, ever since then, ein toiv beloi ra, ve'ein ra beloi toiv. There's no good without bad, there's no bad without good. I was chatting to somebody earlier today about immigration. You know how it is. South Africa, you're always going to talk to somebody at some point about immigration. So I was talking to somebody about immigration. And they were talking about where they live and the very strict lockdown that's in force at the moment. And I was talking about where we live and the very strict lockdown that is enforced on paper. And he said, you see, every place you go, you get to choose which good are you exchanging for which bad. The freedom of being, basically what he was saying, where he lives, if somebody breaks the law, your neighbor will report you to the police. Here, if you break the law, your neighbor will come join you. That's the more likely thing that's going to happen. So, ein toiv veloi rav, ein rab veloi toiv. There's no situation that is absolutely pristine where you could say this is all good. And there's no situation that is so bad that you could say it's all bad. How many people will tell you, coronavirus, best thing that ever happened to me because it slowed me down and forced me to reprioritize, and I've had to spend time with my family. In the ra, there is toiv. In the bad, there is good. So that's where our nefesh habahamis comes from. The fact that we have an animalistic soul originates at that moment of the eating of the tree of knowledge. At that point in time, there became this impulsive side of ourselves that is confused between bad and good. Sometimes it feels itself attracted to all kinds of nice, holy, appropriate things. I want to be good. I want to be generous. I want to be empathetic. And other times it finds itself like, no, I need to look after me. Why should I always be the doormat of everybody else? It's this interesting tug-of-war of which instinct is going to actually be the dominant instinct. And all of this is represented by a principle called klippa, and specifically klippas noiga. These are the two principles we'll learn about in greater detail later. But basically it means this. Klippa, the direct translation of klippa would be a peel or a shell. So you know what the interesting thing is? Have you ever had the frustration of buying a child a present? So you go and you shop for many hours and you look around and you start to think, would they like this? Would they like that? And you try to work out what's your budget and can you stretch your budget a little bit. Eventually you find what you believe is the perfect gift for their birthday and you buy them this whole big fancy thing and it comes in a large box and it's wrapped up in beautiful paper and everything and you hide it away and comes the day of the birthday and you present it to the child and the child is so excited and they rip open the paper and they open the box and they see the present and they start singing and dancing. This is fantastic. It's exactly what I really wanted. Then you come back 10 minutes later and the child is busy carving a fort out of the cardboard box. So you spend all this money on the toy and the child is like, whoa, look at this. It's going to be a castle and it's amazing and it's got a door that opens. And you think, what was I thinking? I should have just bought a cardboard box for their birthday. So the box in the story is the klippa. The box in the story is the outer shell that kind of hides what's inside, right? That's what the box is. So you can get so caught up in the box that you don't see the present inside for what it's worth. You're too busy celebrating the box. That's called klippa. Klippa is the design of our world where everything has so many layers of wrapping and so many layers of obscuring that we actually miss the real value of what is in life, or what life is all about. So for example, a person will, let's say for argument's sake, you eat. So what do we see? What for us, what's food all about? It's about pleasure, it's about taste, it's about the experience, the social attachment that we have to food because you sit with other people and you eat with other people. And we're absolutely oblivious to the fact that there's a spiritual opportunity when we eat. That by eating, you can say a blessing. By eating, you can get energy into your system, which you could use in order to do a mitzvah. We completely miss that. Completely miss it. So here we are, and we've got this amazing gift, and we play with a box. Play with a wrapper. That's klippa. Klippa is anything that is you ever hear the story? There was this guy who passed away, and he comes upstairs, and they say to him, listen, where would you like to go? There's two choices. There's one floor up and one floor down. Where would you like to go? So he says, can I see the options? Like which is which? So they take him to Gan Eden and he walks inside and it's very beautiful and it's well illuminated and everybody's sitting at tables and they're learning mystical texts and it's like amazing. He says, okay, show me the other place. They show another place, of course, it's a bit further down. He's got to like look over the edge of a cloud and it looks all the way down. And what does he see? Magnificent tropical island that's absolutely beautiful, looks gorgeous, white beaches. And you can see down there that there's like a bar and you can get your tropical drinks and your mojitos and who knows what. So, send me there. I've never been a big student. Send me there. Sure, no problem. The angel gives him a kick off the cloud. He falls and falls and falls and falls until eventually he hits this big, beautiful blue sea, goes straight through it. And the next thing he lands up on a skewer, roasting on a rotisserie. He says, oh, what happened over here? What did you just show me? They say, no, that's the screensaver. That's Klippa, right? That's Klippa. It all looks beautiful. It's the shop window dressing. It looks amazing. Until you actually get a little deeper, then you find, no, that was rubbish. That was nonsense. But nobody looks deeper because we're too busy looking hypnotized by the beauty of this, this wonderful, shining, bright, neon light. That's what attracts us. So there are two kinds of klippa. There's klippa that blocks us so successfully that we never look further. And then there's what is called klippas noiga, which means that I see that there's something behind the screen. I don't know what it is, but I notice that there's something behind the screen. There's something to be looking for. There's something light inside this closed environment. And that's where our nefesh habahamis lives, our animal soul. Our animal soul consistently produces sheets to block our view, and at the same time it throws us hints. There's actually something more. There's something good. So our nefesh habahamis, our animal soul, is mostly running around saying, hey, look at me, I have my needs, you better satisfy my needs. If you're not satisfying my needs, you're not an important person, then I'll get angry at you. The fire element. Or this is the animal soul will express itself as saying, give. How else can we enjoy life? Let's try this experience and that experience. Or it's just wasting its time with nebulous ideas, or it's just stuck and, in the mud, lazy and apathetic. But every once in a while, this nefesh habahamis kind of like surprises you with some kindness, with some benevolence, with some compassion that you really didn't see coming. That's the uniqueness of being Jewish. And that's the challenge of being Jewish. Because if you're Jewish and you're nice, then you're just following your instincts. And then you're not really better than a nice animal. There are different animals around. Some of them are really nice. Some of them get up in the morning and they sing beautiful songs. Some of them arch their way out of the water through the waves, and it's absolutely magnificent to watch. Some of them build huge dams that keep us awe-inspired, or weaver nests, and we're like, wow, they're beautiful animals, but they're still animals. For a Jewish person to turn around and say, I am special because I'm kind and compassionate, because I'm a mentsch, we say, so you're a mentsch. Big deal. That's how you're wired. If you were not a mentsch, that would be the surprise. If you were cruel, that would be the surprise. If you were cold and without any compassion, that would be a surprise. Because the nature of the instinctive nefesh habahamis that you have is that there's goodness glowing out of it all the time. You haven't grown yet. You haven't achieved yet. You haven't fulfilled your purpose in this world yet. If you were not Jewish, different story. This is not the case when we analyze the base soul. Remember, here we're talking about the base soul of what it is to be Jewish. So there's a base, there's a nefesh, there's a base, raw, undeveloped soul of what it is to be not Jewish. Hey, mishar klippos tomeos. That base soul lives behind a wall of klippa that is far more powerful and impermeable than what we experience. She'ein bohen toiv klal. This is the part that's highly controversial, as you can well imagine, because the indication is there's no inbred natural goodness. To be a mentsch for the rest of the population is an achievement. To be kind and compassionate for the rest of the population is to be lauded. Shkoyach, well done. You became nice. Who are the archetypes in our history of the Jew and the Gentile world? Yaakov and Esav. Who's Yaakov? Ishtam, Yoshev Oyhalim. He's a person of a meek nature who sits in the tent and with his head buried in the books. He's a person of benevolence. He's a person of integrity. He's a person of kindness. So Yaakov's journey of spiritual development does not start until he leaves his cocoon, until he goes out there and challenges himself to confront things that are totally out of his reality. Because to be a nice guy in a nice environment, no big deal, no value. His twin, Esav, not a nice guy. He battles with all of these things. He battles with aggression, and he battles with jealousy, and he battles as a womanizer. He battles with all of the things that are antithetical to Judaism. So the Torah gives him credit for the fact that he treated his father well, because for him that was a big deal. And he actually gains all these interesting little accolades through the course of his life for little things. He sheds a few tears. The Torah makes a huge fuss about it. Wow, Esav could shed a tear. It's not his default setting. So when somebody says that it's narcissistic to claim that the Jewish people are the chosen people, it's not narcissistic. It's a huge admission of responsibility. Any human being, follow the evolutionary Darwinist approach, every human being is self-interested. Every human being has drives, and those drives have to be considered and accepted. If a person can learn some self-control, if a person can learn to become a modified human with a sense of concern for the next person, that is an amazing achievement. For a Jewish person, Tanya tells us, that's no achievement. You haven't started the process yet. The natural state of the majority of the world, the normal state of a human being is that a human being only does good things with some kind of self-interest. Legarmayu. How's it going to pay me back? If I'm going to be philanthropic, what's the kickback for me? Not a kickback necessarily financially, but what kind of recognition will I have? What kind of a legacy will I leave, and so on and so forth. If I'm going to be nice to somebody, it's because there's a certain satisfaction that they're going to have, or it will suit a particular religious agenda I have, or whatever it might be. There has to be a personal value. Like the Gemara comments on a verse, a very disturbing verse that says, that kindness of the nations is a sin. How does the Gemara explain this? That by nature, the way that the world, the way that the average human being looks to do charity or kindness is for recognition. That is a normal human drive. And to expect otherwise of people, to expect that they'll be absolutely altruistic, is not realistic. But to expect of a Jewish person that they should be altruistic is critical. Right? Absolutely critical. Now, when the Alter Rebbe was arrested by the Russians, it was on trumped-up charges, and they accused him of treason, and it became a whole thing, and he was in prison for a month and a half. They cross-examined him on a whole lot of questions about his philosophy and about his attitude towards the king and so on. And each time, the Alter Rebbe answered to their satisfaction. The final question that they asked him was about this piece of Tanya. They said, how can you say this? How can you say such disparaging things about every single human on earth except for the tiny little handful of Jewish people? How can you speak this way? And the Alter Rebbe did not respond. He gave a smile and he left it at that, and they did not probe any further. And you could try read into that. You could read into that either that they felt that their own behavior had kind of proven his point. You know, when you've just mistreated the leader of the Jewish world, it's a little bit of a stretch to say, but I'm really a good person. You know, I mean, you didn't necessarily do your homework before you arrested him and set him up for a capital offense. Maybe you're not such a nice person. And the other way to read the story is that the Alter Rebbe had satisfactorily answered all of their questions to that point, and effectively was implying to them, do you really want me to get to that level of detail? You've already been happy with every explanation that I've given. Do you really want me to spell it out for you? Our Rebbe pointed out on this particular piece of Tanya that effectively what we need to recognize is this. There's a concept called Chasidei Umois Ha'olam, which means a Gentile who has achieved recognition in Hashem's eyes that they deserve the greatest rewards. What does a non-Jewish person need to do in order to facilitate that recognition? To be a mentsch. The most important thing is to be a mentsch. But the minute you're Jewish, that is not going to cut it. Because the expectation is that to be a mentsch should be in your DNA. Now you want to grow. Now you want to serve Hashem. Well, let's first find out about the nature of your soul in the next chapter. Let's explain how that soul operates in chapters 3, 4, and 5. Let's understand the nature of the conflict that you feel inside of yourselves and why your soul isn't necessarily on fire as it should be in chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9. And then we can define who the different kinds of Jews are, Tzaddik, Benoni, and Rasha, in chapters 10, 11, and 12. And then we can start talking about, so how do you actually grow as a Jewish person? Because as long as we're hiding behind the fact that we're nice people with an unusual amount of compassion and goodness, we're completely missing the point of what Hashem expects of us. So that's what we're going to start learning, please God, from next week.